What's up, everybody? Tara Wellman here. Welcome back to Birdseeds. This is the very first series preview of the 2019 season featuring your St. Louis Cardinals against the reigning NL Central champion, Milwaukee Brewers. Now, if this is your first time here, thanks for joining us. Be sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications so that you get notified every time a series preview goes up so that you can wow all your friends with how ready you are for every series of the season. To kick us off, I've invited my good friend Kyle Lesniewski back to the show to get us all set for the opening series in Milwaukee. Now, this is a division that is going to be very tough, if not the toughest in baseball. And it all starts right now. So without further ado, Kyle, let's talk about the Brewers. Well, Kyle, thank you for joining me again. It's been a while, but it is time to talk baseball again. And man, we'll get into this division and how you see it all shaking out, but it's exciting that we're back to talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems for me like the winter flew by pretty quickly and all of a sudden into spring training and all that kind of stuff. But of course, it's easy to forget that this was the shortest offseason we've had in Milwaukee in 7 years. So we got, a little bit of a late start than you guys did down in St. Louis. So I guess that's probably a big reason why.
Yeah, that sneaks up on you. You don't realize how much that cuts into the offseason until it does, right? The Brewers wrapped up their spring training sort of exhibition tour in Montreal, but without Ryan Braun. Do you want to explain what happened there, or...
So, the team schedules this exhibition series in a foreign country like last year. So everybody knew that it was happening, and, everybody reported to spring training 6 weeks ago, and apparently nowhere along the line anybody thought it would be a good idea to remind everybody, hey, you got your passports and all that kind of stuff for this Canada trip, and apparently they show up for the plane, and Ryan Braun goes, whoops, I forgot mine.
Forgot or forgot? Did
yeah,
he not want to go on that trip?
That seems to be the question. I think for a 35-year-old who's already going to be dealing with scheduled days off throughout the course of the regular season, maybe it's best for everyone if he just takes these next couple of days off, and I'm sure that probably was kind of in the back of his mind.
It's not his first day, shall we say.
Right.
So this offseason, not only was it shorter, it wasn't quite as flashy as last offseason, bringing Yelich and Kane into the mix, but the Brewers did pick up a very strong addition in Grandal, kind of the headliner of the offseason for the Brewers. What is your take on kind of what they did this offseason when, there was sort of this like chess match between teams in the NL Central? Are you going to move? Are they going to move? Who's going to make the best move this offseason?
Right. I guess coming into the offseason, you look at a team that wins 96 games last year, division champions, obviously made a deep run into the playoffs. And outside of, a guy like Wade Miley, who in actuality only made 16 starts for the team last year, and Gio Gonzalez, who only pitched for the team in September, those were pretty much the only guys that weren't coming back again this season. So from the Brewers' perspective, it was easy to look at the team, say, we feel pretty good about what we've got right now. Why don't we just kind of sit back and see how the market plays out and what sort of opportunities we might be presented with that we can take advantage of. And that is pretty clearly what happened with the Yasmani Grandal signing. Pretty clearly the number one catcher on the free agent market this winter, and personally he's a player that I've been kind of stumping for the Brewers to go after for going on 2 years or so now, even back to his days in Los Angeles, and wasn't apparently finding the multi-year offers that he thought that he was worth, and instead of taking a larger guarantee, determined that it was the best course of action for him to seek the highest average annual value that he could get on a 1-year deal. And it just so happened that the Brewers found some change in the couch cushions and gave him $18.25 million to come and play for 2019. And I think it's going to be a pretty significant addition. The way that I kind of look at it is the best thing about the Brewers catching tandem from last year was what they brought to the table defensively, Manny Pena and Eric Kratz. Pena is obviously pretty well known for having a really strong throwing arm and is really excellent at controlling the run game. And Kratz also graded out positively along those lines last season. But the thing that most casual fans probably wouldn't really realize is both of those catchers ranked among the top 20 all throughout all of baseball in terms of pitch framing, both on a per pitch basis as well as total runs added basis. So those extra strikes here and there, I mean, that adds up over the course of the season. I think between the two of them, they added something along the lines of 20 to 25 runs to the team's ledger just in terms of pitch framing. So bringing in Yasmani Grandal, they're not really going to see any sort of diminished production defensively going from that tandem to a tandem of Grandal and Manny Pena. Grandal has consistently rated among the top 5 catchers in baseball for the last half dozen years or so in terms of pitch framing and runs added via framing, and was the number 1 catcher in that statistic last year, according to Baseball's Prospectus, with 18 runs or so added on his own. So in terms of handling the pitching staff and defensively, Grandal's got some issues with pass balls, and that was a little more glaring on a bigger stage in the playoffs. But in terms of what he brings in a broader sense defensively, he's going to be a very strong addition and not at all diminish what the Brewers got last year defensively. And then in terms of what he brings at the plate, he had a 125 weighted runs created plus last year, which was about 40% higher in terms of offense than what the Brewers catching tandem brought to the table. So when I talk to people about it, I kind of present it as, think about it as you're bringing in a player who is just as good defensively as Eric Kratz or Manny Pena, but he hits just as well as Travis Shaw. So that, to me, is a pretty enticing package altogether. So I'm extremely pleased with that addition, and along with the addition of Mike Moustakas at second base. 1 through 7, I would say that this offense could stack up with just about any lineup in the National League.
I was impressed and, as a fan of the Cardinals, a little bit intimidated by the Brewers' offense last season, especially with the numbers that Christian Yelich put up. We all saw the year that he had. To add Grandal to that mix, to me, just adds so much depth to kind of the reliability of that lineup. Not necessarily just the potential, but kind of the known commodities in that lineup. So to me, that was a good get for them, just because it sort of solidifies what was already a strength, which is never a bad thing. But you mentioned the pitching. That's really the story for this team, right? Everybody has asked me, how's the starting pitching going to hold up? Is the bullpen going to be enough? And a lot of that has come into question right at the very end of the spring. Oh, the other question I keep getting is, why haven't they signed Craig Kimbrel yet? So let's dive into this pitching puzzle, because while I say that I think the offense is the strength of this team, in many ways it was the bullpen last year that allowed them to be so successful. And right now, a lot of that's in question. Yeah,
absolutely. If you aren't following the Brewers closely, obviously, the injuries that we're talking about are Jeremy Jeffress experiencing some shoulder weakness. He is throwing bullpens right now and going through a strengthening program, and they're targeting mid to late April return date for that, but until it happens, you don't really know what to expect.
Shoulders are so tricky,
right?
You never know.
Yeah,
trust me. Carlos Martinez is very familiar.
Yeah, we've got Jimmy Nelson on our side too. So, But then, so that, I guess, is a little less concerning than what Corey Knebel is dealing with, which the Brewers acquired him back in 2015, that offseason 2014-2015, and the previous year with Texas, he was shut down at the end of the season, missed the final 2 months with some damage to his UCL. He has a slight tear in his right elbow. He was able to rehab that injury, got a PRP injection, and never ended up undergoing Tommy John surgery, and the elbow has been healthy since then. He hasn't had any elbow-related injuries that have forced him to the disabled list in the last 4 years since then. But all of a sudden, he makes his first few appearances in the Cactus League, and he was actually throwing the ball really well, but then complained of some soreness, and apparently was a re-aggravation of this UCL injury, and now the team is kind of taking the next week, 2 weeks, to kind of gather an entire scope of medical opinions and determine what the best course of action moving forward is. But I guess it's a very realistic outcome that Tommy John surgery is what ends up happening here, which would obviously shelf Knebel for the entire season and even into 2020. But even if it's not that, if it's just a matter of rehabbing and trying to rest it and do all that kind of stuff, he's still going to miss multiple months of the season. So obviously, as you mentioned, the bullpen was the biggest strength of the team last year. Craig Counsell being able to go to his bullpen as early as the fifth inning during the course of the regular season, and then even earlier than that in September and October. And now with Jeffress on the table or on the shelf and Knebel on the shelf, the only really top end guy that they have left back there is Josh Hader. And other than that, it's a lot of sort of question marks, and I guess we don't really know what to expect. There's certainly upside in guys like Jacob Barnes and Taylor Williams, guys who we've seen kind of grow up as prospects in the system and have always kind of flashed that sort of closer stuff, but haven't really put it all together yet at this point. And then there's somebody like Junior Guerra who made the transition to relief during September last year and debuted a brand new pitch with a curveball that ended up really turning into a weapon for him, and he turned in 6 scoreless appearances down the stretch, and then another 5 innings in the playoffs with only 1 run allowed. And it seems this spring that he's sort of pitched his way into a prominent sort of role. So they'll be counting on some guys like that to, I guess, step up or take that next step forward, and then looking at guys like Alex Wilson, who they just picked up as a free agent from the Tigers, and Matt Albers, who is looking to kind of bounce back from a shoulder injury last year. So I guess when you look at it beyond Hader, there's certainly a lot of room for volatility. And I think what the Brewers are hoping for at this point is that the amount of depth that they've accrued, they'll have enough arms kind of take that step forward that they'll be able to weather this storm with Jeffress and Knebel for however long both those guys end up missing. And then, as you mentioned, obviously Craig Kimbrel is still hanging out there. He's somebody that the team has been connected to. All the beat writers are quick to downplay that possibility, and I can understand why. The team has spent a pretty considerable amount of money adding to their roster over the last 2 years. According to Cott's contracts, their 40-man roster payroll in terms of what it is against the luxury tax is right around $144 million, which would be far and away a franchise record, and is also the 14th highest total in baseball right now, which is a pretty significant place for the smallest media market in baseball to be. So I guess I'm not exactly crossing my fingers for them to go out and sign Kimbrel, but with David Stearns in the front office and the things that he's been able to pull off the last few years, you can never really say never. And if Kimbrel is willing to back down from his reported asking price of 6 years and and look at something maybe more on a short-term basis, 1 or 2 year deal, I think that's something that that the Brewers would look at more favorably.
It's shocking to me that we're looking at opening day and Kimbrel's still not on a team anywhere. Keuchel's still not on a team anywhere. It's such a bizarre landscape right now for some of those guys, and that's a whole nother conversation. But the point is, in years past, you could guarantee that someone like that is going to be making a difference in a bullpen that needs some backup right now. And you know, we're instead talking about whether he's going to be signed by any team, you know, in the first month of the season. So it's a really weird climate. You mentioned Junior Guerra. I have to ask you about him because he's your guy. Do you like him in a role like is being talked about for him, whether it's closing or just kind of being one of those high leverage bullpen arms? Because I don't know if you are all following Kyle or not, but Junior Guerra Day is a real thing. And we saw a lot of it last year when he finally made his way into the rotation.
You know, as when you look at how he performed down the stretch, He missed a few weeks in the middle of the season, right after the All-Star game last year, with some soreness in his forearm, which is something that can be alarming. It's oftentimes a precursor to Tommy John surgery sort of issues. And he's obviously a very heavy splitter-oriented pitcher, which is, I guess, believed to put a lot of excess stress on the elbow and can cause more injuries. And after he returned from that injury, he really just wasn't the same guy. He had a lot of difficulty controlling his splitter specifically, but also falling behind hitters a lot more regularly. And when you're pitching from behind, and you know the only thing you can really go to is your fastball, it makes it a little bit easier for hitters to know what to expect. So I think that it is pretty significant that he's been able to incorporate this curveball into his arsenal and really feature it in a pretty heavy manner. He's kind of been able to push that splitter to his third pitch and not have to rely on throwing it so much, which has helped his arm kind of bounce back a little bit better when it comes to making these shorter stints on shorter rest. And he was flashing some really good stuff this spring. He was up to 95, 96 early on, which is 2 or 3 miles an hour faster than he was pitching as a starter. And he's a guy who can miss a lot of bats, and he can get a ground ball when you need it. And I think that the Baseball Prospectus Annual put it best in their comment for Junior Guerra this year. It was Junior Guerra has the smarts to start, the guile to close, and the intelligence to reinvent himself to take advantage of every opportunity.
That's a pretty ringing endorsement, I think, of a guy that you might need in any one of those situations. It's such an interesting opportunity for Craig Kimbrel to do what he does and mix those guys in just the right way. But without him in the rotation, there is a legitimate youth movement happening with this Brewers rotation. How confident are you in that when there are questions in the bullpen right now, and the whole idea about this Brewers rotation is that if they can get it to the bullpen, they'll be fine?
You know, it does make it a little bit more difficult to be confident, I guess, in the entire pitching staff when, like you said, the idea of the starting rotation is that it's predicated on just being able to keep teams in games, or keep the team in the game through the 5th inning or so, and then turn things over to all these guys who throw 98 and can strike everybody out in the back end of the bullpen. But at the same time, as a Brewers fan, it's kind of thrilling to see all 3 of these guys get this opportunity at the same time. As a franchise, historically, the Brewers have struggled to develop quality starting pitchers. And this, going back, I guess I can't really think of a time, maybe like 2012 was the last time they had 3 prospects who made their major league debuts with the organization, all kind of pitching in the rotation at the same time. And it didn't end up going very well back then. Those guys were like Willie Peralta, Tyler Thornburg, and Johnny Helweg. And
most people are going, who?
Yeah, I wouldn't really worry about it. But I guess I feel a little bit better about this group of arms now, and they've generated a lot of buzz with scouts. All three of the guys have been picked out by various sites as potential breakout candidates for the Brewers this year. A scout from Baseball America recently said that Brandon Woodruff has the potential to be a 70 grade starter on the 2080 scouting scale. Freddie Peralta obviously has shown that he can strike guys out basically throwing only his fastball just because of how deceptive his delivery is. And Corbin Burns is an elite spin rate artist and was in the top 10% in terms of ability to generate swings and misses last year, while he was posting a 2.60 ERA out of the bullpen. So it's really exciting to see all three of these guys line up, all three of these guys who have already shown in, I guess, sort of extended situations what their upside is and just how big of an impact they can have on a major league pitching staff. So I'm really excited to see what they can all put together this year. Overall, I feel pretty confident that the starting pitching staff 1 through 5 plus depth pieces will be able to contribute at least a league average performance, with a lot of room to be better than that, depending on how big of steps forward these three young guys can take.
And the Cardinals will see those three young guys in the first series. It'll be Miles Mikolas up against Jhoulys Chacín in the opening game. Then it'll be, I'm very intrigued by the second two games. Jack Flaherty against Freddie Peralta, and then Dakota Hudson, the young guy for the Cardinals that snagged a rotation spot against Brandon Woodruff in Game 3, and then Michael Wacha against Burns in Game 4. So some very intriguing young starting pitching in this opening series. Let's go back to the offense a little bit and talk a little bit of defense. We'll go outfield, then infield. Let's start with Mr. I Forgot My Passport himself. I was reading some of your previews for this season. You recently wrote about Ryan Braun saying that he has decided to join the launch angle revolution, which I thought was funny because so many people talk about it, especially guys of his generation of baseball, as if it's this stigma on the game right now. But what is it that he has done this season to try to regain a little of the pop that he has and really put himself in a position to, when he plays, as you mentioned, he's going to have days off, but when he plays, to be a contributor for this team?
Yeah, I think Ryan Braun specifically is a really interesting case in how he performed last season. His overall batting line came in at a 105 weighted runs created plus, which was the lowest total of his career. But keeping in mind that that's still an output that's 5% above the league average. But when you listen to him talk about his season, he's oftentimes referencing his exit velocity and his hard hit rate and his line drive rate, and all of those were at or even better than his previous career highs, and all of those statistics kind of indicate that he was, within the top 15% or so hitters in the big leagues last year. The difference between his actual weighted on base average and the StatCast metric expected weighted on base average was 38 points, which was something like the fifth highest difference of any hitter in baseball. For reference, his expected batting average was 296 and his expected slugging percentage was 515. So if he's putting up those kinds of numbers, looking solely at his batted balls, I guess you can't really conclude that there's much involved other than, sort of the bad luck of when you hit it hard, you're hitting it right at somebody. And that's kind of what Ryan Braun and the front office seem to have concluded about his performance last season. So over the offseason, Braun hired a private hitting coach and worked on making what he calls are some subtle changes to his bat path as it comes through the strike zone. And he says that it's not something that I guess is really going to be visible to the naked eye unless you're like really in tune with the mechanics of the baseball swing. But it's something that he believes is going to be able to make a pretty significant difference in his offensive output and kind of turn some of those hard hit line drives that are right at somebody into home runs that go over the fence. So I guess when you look at those metrics, and Braun had a pretty strong spring. He put up an OPS over 800. He looks like a pretty good bounce back candidate to me. And even if he can perform at the level that he did last year, that's not going to be something that holds the team back. And I think that most people in the organization feel pretty good about that being kind of like the baseline for what Ryan Braun's going to do this year. But it certainly wouldn't surprise me to see him kind of bounce back to hit something like 280, 340, 480, and 25 plus home runs, something like that, depending on how his health holds up and how often he's able to get on the field. But he seemed to kind of settle in about that 450, 500 plate appearance range or so the last few years. And if he's able to get to that, I think that the contributions that they'll be able to get from the rest of their outfield and then their bench with Ben Gamel and Hernan Perez, they'll be able to sustain some pretty strong production.
The Cardinals fans watching this are very familiar with the idea of needing a bounce back year from an outfielder at least. We've got a couple of those that are looking for bounce back years. As far as the infield is concerned, it's veteran Mike Moustakas, you mentioned it, re-signing with the Brewers, this time to play second base. That's a choice. How comfortable are you with that being a choice for him at this point in his career, moving to a position he's never really played before?
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, what Mike Moustakas is attempting to do this season is something that basically is unprecedented across the history of Major League Baseball. Aaron
no pressure
Gleeman
or anything.
Yeah, Aaron Gleeman at Baseball Prospectus did kind of a deep dive into the history earlier this year, and he could find 0 instances of a player in the last 80 years successfully moving up the defensive spectrum after the age of 30. So coming into the offseason, there were the rumors about Moustakas and the Brewers that kind of persisted throughout the winter as long as he sat on the free agent market. And for me, I just thought that, there might have been more clean fits out there, even if it would have been somebody like a Wilmer Flores or a Derek Dietrich or somebody like that. Not that those guys are, gold glovers at second base, but they at least have experience at the position, and they've shown, pretty strong bats throughout their career. And both of those guys signed for significantly less than the Brewers gave Moustakas. The Brewers passed on all those deals. They passed on pretty reasonable deals that Jed Lowry got and that Marwin Gonzalez got. And it seems like all along, I guess they wanted to bring back Mike Moustakas. Mike Moustakas is a player that the front office certainly seems to like. All of his teammates kind of rallied around and were sort of stumping for the organization to bring him back throughout the offseason. Ryan Braun had some pretty strong quotes. Christian Yelich had some pretty strong quotes. And all three of those guys were working together throughout the course of the winter on their California Strong project to benefit the victims of the wildfires out in Southern California, which is where all those three guys make their homes. So the owner and the general manager kind of had a bug in their ear from several players throughout the winter that, hey, we like Moustakas, we want him back in this clubhouse, and they came to him with this idea like, hey, we'll re-sign you, but we're going to put Travis Shaw, who was nominated for the Gold Glove at third base last year, back to play that position, and we're going to stick you at second base instead. And everything that Moustakas has said has seemed like he's been on board with the move from day one. He seems excited about it. There hasn't been any kind of grumbling or anything like that. And I think there was a rumor that he actually turned down a multi-year offer from somewhere else, presumably to play third base, in order to return to Milwaukee to specifically play in Milwaukee and play at second base. He looked pretty good out there, I guess, as good as one would expect throughout the spring. The Brewers know that he's not going to provide a ton of range in the infield, but they're not necessarily looking for that. They just want him to make the plays that he, I guess, should make and take advantage of his sure hands and his strong throwing arm and just kind of do what he's physically capable of doing out there. And with the way that they align their defense, they kind of use Orlando Arcia as sort of a rover and position. He's listed at shortstop, but he's not lining up at shortstop very often. So they think that because of what he can bring to the table defensively, that they'll be able to kind of get away with the sort of limited range that Moustakas is going to be able to provide at second base, and just kind of provide an overall average-ish defense and hope that the bat will do the talking.
Another example, I think, of kind of the way that Craig Counsell can, get guys to buy into something that's a little bit unusual and show how it can be successful, even if it's not what they've done before or what they've seen before, which I think is a huge asset to having a guy like that who is a communicator that can, present these things that not only are creative, but also he can show you how it might actually be successful as well. The NL Central, as I mentioned, going to be a gauntlet this year. Any bold predictions as you look at what is to come in the Central this season?
Yeah, I guess honestly, I'm kind of nervous to see how it's all going to play out now that the bullpen has kind of been sort of thrown into flux here in Milwaukee. I was feeling fairly confident about the team's ability to repeat. I don't necessarily think that they would have won 96 games or would line up to win 96 games again. But when you look at the projection systems and that sort of stuff, that doesn't really factor in how a team will play in one-run games and any of that kind of stuff. And it's tough for me right now to say that I think the Brewers are the clear favorites. I really think that it's going to be a dogfight between the Cubs and the Cardinals and the Brewers. And it wouldn't surprise me, honestly, if all five teams win 80-plus games this year. I think the Pirates should be decent, and I actually like what the Reds have done.
Yeah, me too.
I think they've added a lot of upside to their team without having to really expend any significant sort of capital. So I'm curious to see how it plays out in Cincinnati and how big of a difference Derek Johnson can make with their pitching staff. So I wouldn't be surprised, I guess, if the Reds really kind of turn into that surprise darling of the division this year and are still making some noise in September, as well presumably the Brewers, Cubs, and Cardinals are all jockeying for position.
The Reds kind of have that excitement factor right now, too. There's a little bit of a buzz that hasn't been there for them in quite some time, so that'll be interesting. Okay, one or two keys for the opening series this weekend in Milwaukee.
I think that being able to put the ball in play, especially in those middle games, as you mentioned, with Flaherty and Weaver. Hudson with Flaherty and Hudson. Obviously, Freddie Peralta and Brandon Woodruff are two guys that are going to probably miss a lot of bats, and I think between all four of those starting pitchers that there's going to be a lot of strikeouts racking up on both sides of the offense. So whichever team can kind of get the ball in play a little bit more and hopefully take advantage of that nice 68-degree air that we'll be enjoying inside of Miller Park. I think that'll go a long way towards kind of determining who can get their best foot forward in this opening series.
I finally got to experience Miller Park for the first time last season, so I'm very familiar with the nice bonus of a little bit of climate control, whether it's boiling hot outside or, a little bit chilly this time of year. I think we often talk about games that have sort of a playoff feel to them. Obviously, you can't necessarily say that in the opening weekend, but I do think this first round through the Central is going to be really interesting because all these teams feel like they really have a shot right now. And it's been a while, I think, since there was sort of that even playing field across the board when a season started. So it will be interesting to see how things get started. Kyle, thank you so much for your time. Very much looking forward to this weekend. And where can people find you if they need more Brewers info?
You can follow me personally at BrewerFan28, or you can follow our site's account at Brew Crew Ball, and you can find all my work at brewcrewball.com.
All right, there it is. You will have more Brewers information than you're probably looking for, but if you need it, it will be there. Kyle, thanks so much.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Kyle will have you covered on the Brewers front all season long, so if there's anything that you are dying to know, maybe for the sake of your fantasy team, if nothing else, make sure you are following Kyle on Twitter and his work over at Brew Crew Ball, and I will link all of that in the description below. Again, if this is your first time joining us, thank you for being here, and if it's not your first time but you haven't subscribed yet, well, you should really do something about that. And turn your notifications on if you want to find out every time a new video is posted. There will be series previews, there will be about last nights, there will be all sorts of other things that are in the works right now for the coming season. So make sure you're subscribed, turn on the notifications. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up because that lets other people know that they might like it too. And of course, make sure you're following me on Twitter because there will be plenty more to come from me there as well. And of course, finally, a shout out to everyone over at Birds on the Black. Guys, we are ready for another season. It starts right now. Until next time, I'm Tara Wellman. Bye-bye.